Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where tonight we're venturing to one of Earth's most extraordinary places, a nation that exists almost entirely on water, scattered across an ocean area larger than India, yet with a total landmass you could lose in a decent-sized city park. We're exploring Kiribati, 33 coral atolls sprinkled across the central Pacific like nature's own ambitious archipelago experiment. This is a story that spans from ancient Polynesian navigators who found these tiny specks of land using nothing but stars and ocean swells, to modern communities facing perhaps the most dramatic challenge any nation has ever confronted: the very real possibility that their homeland might simply disappear beneath the waves. It's a tale of remarkable resilience, where people have thrived for millennia on islands so low that a decent storm surge can flood your entire neighborhood. From traditional sailing techniques that would impress GPS manufacturers, to World War II battles that turned paradise into a strategic chess piece, to contemporary climate adaptation projects that sound like science fiction but represent very real hope, Kiribati's story contains more plot twists than most novels, and significantly more practical lessons about living with uncertainty. If this kind of in-depth exploration appeals to you, and honestly, where else are you going to learn about coral atoll geology at bedtime? Hit that subscribe button now. Trust me, you'll want to catch the rest of this series. So adjust your pillows, perhaps brew some tea, and let's drift into the fascinating world of Kiribati. Chapter 1: Introduction and Geographic Overview. We're talking about Kiribati, and before you start practicing your pronunciation in your head, it's Kiribati, not Kiribati. The locals probably got tired of correcting tourists decades ago, though to be fair, tourists are about as common in Kiribati as snow leopards in the Sahara. Kiribati is what happens when Mother Nature plays a cosmic game of connect the dots across 33 islands scattered over an area roughly the size of the continental United States. Imagine trying to govern a country where your nearest neighbour might be 1,000 miles away, and suddenly your local traffic problems seem rather manageable. The total land area of all these islands combined equals just over 300 square miles, smaller than New York City, but spread across an ocean so vast that it makes the Atlantic look like a neighborhood pond. These 33 coral atolls and reef islands are divided into 3 distinct groups, each with their own personality. The Gilbert Islands form the main population center and seat of government. The Phoenix Islands serve as a mostly uninhabited nature preserve that makes Antarctica look crowded, and the Line Islands stretch so far east that they're practically neighbors with Hawaii, if Hawaii were the type of neighbor who lived several time zones away and rarely visited. The geography of Kiribati defies conventional understanding. This is a nation where the highest point above sea level reaches the dizzying height of about 13 feet, roughly equivalent to a 2-story house. If you're afraid of heights, Kiribati might just be your perfect vacation destination. The islands are classic coral atolls, formed over millions of years as coral reefs grew around volcanic islands that have since sunk beneath the waves, leaving behind these ring-shaped remnants that look from above like nature's own donuts scattered across the Pacific. The climate here is tropical, which sounds lovely until you realize that tropical in the middle of the Pacific means it's hot, humid, and occasionally visited by weather systems that would make a meteorologist weep. The trade winds provide some relief, though they also bring the kind of consistency that makes every day feel like Groundhog Day, except with more coconuts and significantly fewer groundhogs. Rainfall varies dramatically across the island groups. The northern islands often experience drought conditions that would make a cactus nervous, while the southern islands receive enough rain to keep things green and growing. This variation creates a fascinating ecological diversity across the country. though diversity is relative when you're dealing with coral atolls that are, by geological standards, about as biodiverse as a parking lot. The surrounding ocean isn't just scenery, it's everything. The exclusive economic zone of Kiribati covers over 1.3 million square miles of Pacific Ocean, making it one of the largest maritime territories in the world. To put this in perspective, Kiribati's ocean territory is larger than India, yet its land area could fit inside the city of Phoenix, Arizona, with room to spare for several strip malls and at least one decent coffee shop. This ocean territory contains some of the world's most pristine marine environments. The Phoenix Islands Protected Area is one of the largest marine protected areas on the planet, covering an area roughly the size of California. It's home to coral reefs that have never heard of bleaching, fish populations that wouldn't know what a fishing net looks like, and marine ecosystems that operate exactly as they have for millennia, blissfully unaware that the rest of the world's oceans are having something of an existential crisis. The isolation of Kiribati cannot be overstated. Tarawa, the capital atoll, is approximately 2,500 miles from the nearest major landmass. For context, that's roughly the distance from New York to Denver, except instead of crossing states with rest stops and gas stations, you're crossing empty ocean with the occasional albatross for company. The nearest major city is Honolulu, which is still over 1,000 miles away, close enough to dream about, far enough to make you appreciate whatever entertainment options are available locally. This remoteness has shaped everything about Kiribati, from its history to its culture to its relationship with the rest of the world. When your nearest neighbours are separated by distances that would challenge a modern jetliner, you develop a particular perspective on community, self-reliance, and the art of making your own entertainment. It's the kind of isolation that either makes you very zen or very creative, and fortunately for Kiribati, it seems to have chosen both. The population of Kiribati hovers around 120,000 people, most of whom live on the Gilbert Islands, particularly around South Tarawa. Population density on South Tarawa rivals that of Hong Kong, which creates the interesting paradox of living in one of the world's most isolated countries while simultaneously dealing with urban overcrowding. It's like being alone in the universe while stuck in an elevator with half your neighbours. Transportation between islands remains a challenge that would test the patience of a saint. Inter-island flights are infrequent, weather-dependent, and operate on schedules that treat punctuality as more of a gentle suggestion than a firm commitment. Shipping connections are even more sporadic, with cargo vessels arriving when they arrive, carrying everything from rice to construction materials, to the occasional tourist who's really committed to getting off the beaten path. The economy of Kiribati is as unique as its geography. Fishing licenses sold to foreign fleets provide significant government revenue, essentially monetizing the vastness of their ocean territory. Copra production from coconut palms continues as it has for generations, though global coconut markets are apparently as unpredictable as Pacific weather patterns. Remittances from Kiribati working abroad, particularly seafarers on international vessels, form another crucial economic pillar, a reminder that sometimes you have to leave home to support home. Tourism exists, but calling it an industry would be generous. Visitors to Kiribati are typically researchers, aid workers, or the occasional adventurer who has exhausted all other options for authentic cultural experiences. The tourism infrastructure operates on a scale that makes boutique hotels look like massive resort complexes. If you're the type of traveller who needs daily housekeeping and room service, Kiribati might gently suggest you reconsider your destination choices. The infrastructure challenges are as vast as the ocean surrounding the islands. Electricity is often generated by diesel generators that arrived by ship months ago, assuming the ship arrived at all. Internet connectivity exists, but operates at speeds that would make dial-up users nostalgic for the good old days. Fresh water comes primarily from rainwater collection and groundwater lenses, both of which are vulnerable to the kinds of environmental changes that make long-term planning an exercise in optimistic uncertainty. Education and healthcare systems operate under constraints that would challenge the most resourceful administrators. Schools on outer islands might have one teacher managing multiple grades, while healthcare often means travelling to Tarawa for anything more complex than basic first aid. The dedication of teachers and healthcare workers who serve these remote communities deserves recognition alongside any list of unsung heroes in human development. Yet despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, Kiribati has developed a cultural resilience that urban societies might envy. Communities that must rely entirely on each other tend to develop social bonds that modern connectivity can't replicate. When your survival depends on cooperation rather than competition, you develop different priorities and different definitions of success. The traditional knowledge systems of Kiribati represent thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about living sustainably in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Navigation techniques that allowed ancient voyagers to find these tiny islands across vast ocean distances, agricultural methods that coax crops from coral soil, and fishing practices that maintain marine ecosystems while feeding communities. These represent sophistication that modern technology is still trying to match. As we settle in for our journey through Kiribati's story, remember that this is a nation that exists at the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern challenges, of vast ocean territory and tiny land areas, of complete isolation and global connectivity. It's a place where the past, present, and future converge in ways that challenge our assumptions about how nations develop and survive. The story of Kiribati is ultimately a story about adaptation, how humans have adapted to one of the most remote and challenging environments on Earth, and how they continue adapting to changes that threaten the very existence of their homeland. It's a reminder that resilience takes many forms, and that sometimes the smallest nations carry the biggest lessons about what it means to persist in an uncertain world. The environmental challenges facing Kiribati are as complex as they are urgent. Rising sea levels threaten not just individual islands, but the entire concept of Kiribati as a place that exists in physical space rather than just in memory and culture. Some outer islands have already lost significant portions of their land area, while others face saltwater intrusion into freshwater supplies that makes agriculture increasingly difficult. It's like watching a very slow-motion disaster movie, except the popcorn is coconut and the ending is still being written. The concept of sovereignty takes on unique meaning when your entire country could theoretically disappear beneath the waves within the next century. Kiribati has become an unwilling pioneer in discussions about climate refugee status, environmental migration, and what happens to a nation's legal status when its physical territory no longer exists. These aren't abstract policy questions here. They're dinner-table conversations about whether grandchildren will grow up speaking Ai Kiribati on their ancestral atolls, or in some distant country that agreed to take in climate refugees. Water management in Kiribati requires the kind of careful planning that would impress a desert nomad. Fresh water comes from rainfall collected in tanks and cisterns, supplemented by groundwater that sits in fragile lenses above salt water. Too much pumping, and you get salt. Too little rain, and you get nothing. Too much rain, and your collection systems overflow while your neighbours run dry. It's a hydrological puzzle that requires both engineering expertise and the kind of community cooperation that makes neighbourhood water rights disputes look like friendly disagreements. Food security operates on principles that supermarket shoppers might find enlightening. Local agriculture focuses on crops that can tolerate salt spray, irregular rainfall, and soil that's essentially ground up coral with delusions of being farmland. Breadfruit, coconuts and pandanus provide staples, while kitchen gardens produce vegetables that have learned to thrive in conditions that would challenge most houseplants. Fishing provides protein, assuming weather conditions cooperate and fish populations remain stable. Two assumptions that are becoming increasingly optimistic. The telecommunications infrastructure of Kiribati operates on a scale that makes connecting with the outside world feel like sending messages in bottles, except the bottles have antennas and occasionally work. Internet service exists, but at speeds that make streaming anything more complex than text-A exercise in patience. Phone service connects most inhabited areas, though most is relative when you're talking about 33 islands scattered across millions of square miles of ocean. Energy production in Kiribati relies heavily on imported diesel fuel, which arrives by ship on schedules determined by weather, global shipping routes, and the occasional mechanical breakdown that would strand a more connected nation, but barely registers as unusual in the Pacific. Solar power initiatives are expanding, taking advantage of abundant sunshine that would make solar panel salespeople weep with joy. Battery storage technology becomes crucial when your backup power option is wait for the next fuel shipment. The banking and financial systems operate with the kind of simplicity that urban financial centres might envy. ATMs are rare enough to be noteworthy. Cash transactions dominate daily commerce, and international money transfers require patience and paperwork that test the dedication of anyone trying to send funds home to family. Microfinance initiatives help small businesses develop, though small business in Kiribati might mean a fishing boat, a copra dryer, or a store that stocks whatever the last supply ship brought. Tonight, as we explore this scattered nation in the heart of the Pacific, we'll discover how geography shapes destiny, how isolation fosters innovation, and how a people separated by vast distances remain united by shared purpose. We'll learn about ancient navigation techniques that rival modern GPS systems, colonial encounters that changed everything while somehow changing nothing, and modern challenges that make everyday survival an act of cultural preservation. Sweet dreams await in the warm Pacific breeze, where 33 islands hold stories as deep as the ocean that surrounds them, and where the next chapter of human adaptation to environmental change is being written one tide at a time. Chapter 2: Ancient Origins and Early Settlement. Deep in the vast Pacific, where stars guided voyagers across distances that would challenge modern GPS systems, the story of Kiribati begins not with the arrival of land masses, but with the arrival of dreams. Picture, if you will, ancestors so skilled at navigation that they could find islands smaller than most urban airports across oceans, larger than entire continents, using nothing more than the movement of stars, the behaviour of waves, and an intimate understanding of nature that would make marine biologists weep with envy. The first settlers of what we now call Kiribati, though they knew their homeland as Tungaru, were part of the greatest maritime adventure in human history. These were the Austronesian peoples, seafaring migrants whose journey began somewhere in Southeast Asia around 3,000 years ago. They didn't simply stumble upon these coral atolls while out for a casual paddle. They deliberately sought new lands with the kind of systematic exploration that makes modern real estate development look utterly spontaneous. The earliest archaeological evidence suggests that human settlement of the Gilbert Islands began between 2,000 and 1,500 years ago, though some scholars push this timeline even further back. These dates make the islands relatively recent additions to human geography, considering that humans had been elsewhere for tens of thousands of years. But then again, when your potential new home sits in the middle of nowhere and rises barely above sea level, it takes a certain pioneering spirit, or perhaps spectacular optimism, to call it habitable. The ancestors of the Kiribati belong to what archaeologists call the Lapita Cultural Complex, a civilization renowned for their distinctive pottery decorated with geometric patterns that would make modern artists jealous. These weren't primitive people stumbling around in bark canoes. They were sophisticated engineers who developed double-hulled sailing vessels capable of crossing thousands of miles of open ocean while carrying entire communities, complete with crops, livestock, and probably complaints about the in-flight service. Traditional oral histories preserved through generations in the communal houses called maneaba tell stories that would challenge any Hollywood adventure script. According to Kiribati legend, the creator deity Naro, often depicted as a spider, played a crucial role in shaping their world. Naro supposedly separated the heavens from the earth and created the islands by breaking apart a giant clamshell, which is either profound creation mythology or the ancient equivalent of extremely creative recycling. The name Tarawa itself comes from traditional stories where Naro distinguished it from Karawa, the sky, and Marawa, the ocean. This linguistic connection between the capital and the cosmos reflects the sophisticated worldview of early settlers, who saw their tiny atolls not as isolated specks but as integral parts of a vast, interconnected universe. When your entire nation could fit inside a moderately sized city, maintaining that kind of cosmic perspective requires either remarkable wisdom or really good storytelling abilities. Around 1300 CE, Kiribati experienced what might be considered its first major cultural merger, when a significant wave of Polynesian settlers arrived from Samoa. This wasn't a hostile takeover, more like an ancient version of cultural exchange that would make modern diplomats take notes. The Samoan arrivals brought with them sophisticated clan systems, enhanced navigation techniques, and presumably some very interesting dinner party conversations about where everyone originally came from. These Polynesian influences didn't replace the existing Micronesian culture. Instead, they blended like ingredients in a cultural soup that had been simmering for centuries. The result was a unique society that combined Micronesian practicality with Polynesian social complexity, creating the distinctive Kiribati culture that would persist through colonialism, world wars, and the occasional tourist armed with a guidebook and unrealistic expectations. The integration of Polynesian elements introduced the sophisticated Boti system, a clan-based social organization that would become central to Kiribati society. Each Boti represented a family group with specific rights, responsibilities, and designated positions within the community's social hierarchy. Think of it as ancient social networking, except instead of accumulating likes and followers, you accumulated land rights and speaking privileges in the maneaba. By the 15th century, the islands had developed distinctly different governance systems that would influence their character for centuries. The northern islands, particularly Butaritari and Makin, evolved under centralized chiefly rule led by powerful UA, who wielded authority that would impress medieval monarchs. These chiefs controlled resources, mediated disputes, and generally managed affairs with the kind of absolute authority that makes modern politicians nostalgic. The central and southern islands, however, took a different approach entirely. Instead of powerful individual chiefs, they developed systems based on councils of elders called unimwane. These wise men, and they were invariably men, though women held significant informal influence, made decisions collectively through consensus, debate, and the occasional marathon discussion that would test the patience of even the most dedicated local government enthusiast. The island of Tabitoea stands out as a fascinating exception to both systems. Its name literally means chiefs are forbidden, reflecting a deliberately egalitarian society that rejected hierarchical authority in favour of cooperative governance. Imagine an entire island deciding that nobody gets to be boss, and somehow making it work for centuries. It's either a remarkable example of successful anarchism, or proof that sometimes the best way to avoid political problems is to simply refuse to have politicians. Navigation skills among early Kiribati reached levels that would impress modern maritime academies. Young men learned to read the stars in the maneaba, where rafters and beams were sectioned off to correspond to different segments of the night sky. They memorized the position of each star at sunrise and sunset, learned the star paths between islands, and mastered the subtle art of reading wave patterns that revealed the presence of distant land. These navigation techniques weren't casual hobbies, they were literally matters of life and death. Getting lost at sea in the Central Pacific meant becoming a very small statistic in a very large ocean. Navigators used stones and shells placed on mats to teach star lore, memorizing entire sky charts and passing down knowledge through oral stories that contained encoded sailing directions. It's like having GPS coordinates hidden in nursery rhymes, except infinitely more sophisticated and considerably more poetic. Traditional Kiribati society developed intricate relationships with their marine environment that would impress modern conservationists. Fishing grounds were managed through complex tenure systems that allocated access rights to different clans and families. Fish weren't just grabbed willy-nilly, they were harvested according to seasonal patterns, breeding cycles, and community needs that balanced immediate sustenance with long-term sustainability. The cultivation of freshwater taro in specially constructed pits, called babai, demonstrated remarkable agricultural innovation. These sunken gardens, excavated to reach the freshwater lens beneath the coral, created oases of fertility on islands where soil was essentially ground-up coral mixed with hope. The amount of labour required to create and maintain these gardens would challenge modern agricultural engineers, yet Kiribati communities sustained them for generations. Women played crucial roles in early Kiribati society despite the apparent male dominance of formal political structures. They controlled household economies, managed food distribution, maintained crucial social networks, and possessed specialized knowledge about traditional medicine, childcare, and domestic crafts. Their weaving skills produced mats and garments that served both practical and ceremonial functions, creating textiles that were traded between islands and treasured as heirlooms. The maneaba evolved into more than just a meeting house. It became the architectural embodiment of Kiribati social values. These massive structures, built entirely from local materials using traditional techniques, could accommodate entire communities for important discussions, celebrations, and crisis management. The interior arrangement of boti, designated seating areas for different clans, physically represented the social organization of the community, making abstract relationships literally visible in architectural space. Traditional warfare between islands wasn't the random violence it might appear to casual observers. Inter-island conflicts followed specific protocols, served particular social functions, and operated according to rules that would fascinate anthropologists. Warriors used weapons crafted from local materials, shark-tooth swords, coral slingshots, and armour made from densely woven coconut fibre that provided surprising protection against traditional weapons while looking absolutely magnificent. Oral traditions preserved through generations contain remarkable genealogies that connect modern Kiribati to specific ancestral voyagers, complete with details about which islands they settled, what resources they brought, and how they established the first communities. These stories aren't just entertainment, they're historical documents that encode land rights, social relationships, and cultural obligations in narrative form. It's like having legal documents written as epic poems, except far more memorable and significantly more enjoyable to recite. Religious beliefs before European contact centered on ancestor worship, nature spirits, and the maintenance of harmony between human communities and the marine environment they depended upon. Spirits inhabited specific locations, particular trees, coral formations, or stretches of reef, and required respect, offerings, and careful management to maintain their cooperation with human activities. Traditional religion wasn't about distant deities. It was about maintaining relationships with spiritual forces that lived right next door and had very definite opinions about proper behavior. The concept of time in traditional Kiribati culture operated differently from Western linear progression. Events were measured not by abstract dates, but by relationships to natural cycles, community celebrations, and memorable occurrences that provided reference points for organizing collective memory. A birth might be remembered as occurring during the year of the Great Storm, or a significant voyage might be dated to the season when particular fish were abundant. This created a temporal framework deeply embedded in lived experience rather than abstract calculation. Traditional knowledge systems encompassed remarkable expertise about marine environments, weather prediction, seasonal patterns, and resource management that sustained communities on islands where European explorers would struggle to find drinking water. Kiribati ancestors developed techniques for predicting weather from cloud formations, identifying fish populations from sea conditions, and finding fresh water through indicators that would escape modern observers entirely. As we drift toward sleep tonight, imagine those first voyagers navigating by starlight across oceans that stretch beyond imagination, guided by knowledge passed down through generations and sustained by communities that made survival possible in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Their legacy lives on in every maneaba gathering, every traditional navigation lesson, and every story that connects modern Kiribati to ancestors who transformed scattered coral atolls into vibrant centers of human culture. The establishment of permanent settlements required remarkable ingenuity in adapting to atoll environments that challenged every aspect of human survival. Fresh water came from rainfall collected in natural depressions and carefully maintained cisterns, supplemented by groundwater that floated in fragile lenses above salt water. Too much extraction, and you got salt. Too little rain, and you got nothing. Managing water resources required community cooperation and planning that would impress modern urban engineers. Food security depended on a sophisticated understanding of seasonal cycles, marine biology, and agricultural techniques adapted to coral soil that most plants would consider uninhabitable. Coconut palms provided multiple resources: nuts for eating, fronds for construction, fiber for rope, and sap that could be fermented into toddy, which served as both beverage and social lubricant. Breadfruit trees offered seasonal abundance that required careful preservation techniques to avoid feast or famine cycles. The development of traditional crafts reflected both practical necessity and aesthetic sophistication that would influence Kiribati culture for centuries. Canoe building required master craftsmen who understood not just woodworking but also hydrodynamics, aerodynamics, and the subtle engineering principles that created vessels capable of both speed and stability in Pacific swells. These weren't just boats. They were works of art that happened to float exceptionally well. Traditional music and dance evolved as more than entertainment. They served as repositories of cultural knowledge, vehicles for social bonding, and methods of transmitting information across generations. Dance movements mimicked the behavior of seabirds, particularly the frigate bird and golden plover, whose own navigation abilities provided models for human voyaging. Watching traditional Kiribati dances wasn't just witnessing performance, It was observing encoded lessons about movement, rhythm, and the patterns of nature. Marriage customs developed complex rules that balanced clan relationships, resource allocation, and genetic diversity in ways that would challenge modern family counselors. Marriage within the same boti was generally forbidden, encouraging connections between different clan groups while preventing excessive concentration of resources or power. Courtship rituals involved elaborate gift exchanges, demonstrations of practical skills, and negotiations between families that resembled diplomatic treaties more than romantic arrangements. The seasonal calendar organized community life around natural cycles that determined everything from fishing expeditions to ceremonial celebrations. Different times of year brought different fish species, varying weather patterns, and optimal conditions for specific activities. Traditional knowledge holders could predict weather changes weeks in advance by observing subtle indicators, cloud formations, sea conditions, bird behavior, that escaped casual notice but provided crucial information for community planning. Conflict resolution in traditional Kiribati society relied on elaborate protocols designed to restore community harmony rather than simply punish wrongdoing. Disputes were resolved through public discussions in the maneaba, where community members could voice opinions, suggest solutions, and participate in negotiations that sought consensus rather than victory. The goal wasn't determining who was right, but rather how to restore relationships that made community survival possible. The ancient foundations they established, the clan systems, the navigation techniques, the sustainable fishing practices, the architectural traditions, would prove resilient enough to survive centuries of change, while flexible enough to adapt to circumstances their creators never could have imagined. In tomorrow's exploration, we'll discover how these established communities encountered the wider world, bringing together ancient wisdom and new challenges in ways that would reshape the Pacific forever. Chapter 3: Colonial Encounters and Western Contact. In 1606, when European exploration was still a somewhat casual affair involving lots of getting lost and occasionally stumbling upon entire continents by accident, Portuguese navigator Pedro Fernandes de Queiroz became the first recorded European to lay eyes on what we now know as Kiribati. He sighted Butaritari and Makin during his search for the mythical Terra Australis, naming them the Buen Viaje Islands, Spanish for good voyage. Whether this was optimistic thinking or genuine relief at finding anything recognizable in the vast Pacific remains a delightful mystery. For more than a century and a half after Queiroz, the Gilbert Islands remained largely undisturbed by European visitors, existing in what colonial historians would later call splendid isolation, but what Kiribati probably considered perfectly normal Tuesday afternoon activities. The islands were simply too remote, too small, and apparently too lacking in obvious gold deposits to attract the attention of the exploration-happy Europeans who were busy discovering, claiming, and generally reorganizing the rest of the Pacific. The real game changer came in 1765, when British Commodore John Byron, grandfather of the famous poet, and apparently equally adventurous though considerably less romantic, discovered Nicanor during his circumnavigation of the globe aboard HMS Dolphin. Byron's expedition represented the beginning of more systematic British interest in the Pacific, though systematic is a relative term when your navigation tools consisted essentially of a compass, some questionable maps, and an optimistic attitude toward weather patterns. The islands that would give their European name to the entire Gilbert chain were finally mapped in 1788 by two captains whose timing was impeccable, if unintentional: Captain Thomas Gilbert, commanding the Charlotte, and Captain John Marshall aboard the Scarborough. were actually returning from the rather less glamorous task of transporting convicts to Botany Bay when they sailed through the islands, and provided the first systematic European documentation of several atolls, including Tarawa, Abayang, and Aranuka. These weren't pleasure cruises or scientific expeditions. Gilbert and Marshall were essentially running a maritime taxi service for the British penal system, ferrying unwilling passengers to Australia's first European settlements. Their discovery of the islands was the kind of happy accident that makes exploration sound much more romantic in hindsight than it probably felt at the time, particularly when you're responsible for several hundred seasick convicts and running low on supplies. The name Gilbert Islands didn't stick immediately. Russian Admiral Adam von Krusenstern and French Captain Louis Duperrey officially bestowed the designation Îles Gilbert in about 1820, honouring Captain Gilbert's sightings some 32 years earlier. This delayed naming process reflects the casual pace of Pacific exploration. Apparently cartographers had all the time in the world to sort out their paperwork, which must have been refreshing in an era before GPS coordinates and satellite imagery made everything urgently immediate. The early decades of the 19th century brought the first sustained European contact with Kiribati. Though contact might be too dignified a word for what was essentially a series of increasingly chaotic encounters between two completely different approaches to life, commerce, and basic human dignity. Whaling ships began frequenting the islands as part of the on-the-line grounds, where Pacific whales apparently gathered in convenient hunting formations that made commercial whaling temporarily profitable and permanently devastating to whale populations. Whalers brought with them the full spectrum of 19th century maritime culture: skilled seamanship, entrepreneurial spirit, technological innovation, and a casual attitude toward local customs that would make modern cultural sensitivity trainers weep into their procedural manuals. These weren't necessarily evil men. Many were skilled professionals doing dangerous work in remote locations, but their impact on Kiribati communities was comparable to having several hundred restless, homesick, and frequently intoxicated visitors descend upon your village with no advance notice and very different ideas about acceptable social behaviour. The whaling trade brought Kiribati their first systematic exposure to European diseases, alcohol, firearms, and commercial economics. Island communities that had maintained sustainable populations for centuries suddenly faced epidemics of measles, influenza, and other European diseases for which they had no immunity. Population declines were so severe that some islands lost entire generations of elders, along with the traditional knowledge they carried. Concurrent with the whaling boom came traders seeking coconut oil, which had become valuable for illumination and soap making in European markets. Butaritari, with its relatively protected harbour, became a major trading centre where European merchants established permanent stations to collect and process copra, dried coconut meat that could be shipped to markets thousands of miles away. This marked the beginning of Kiribati's integration into global commodity markets, a development that brought both opportunities and vulnerabilities. The coconut oil trade transformed Kiribati society in ways that traditional chiefs and European traders probably didn't fully anticipate. Suddenly, coconut groves weren't just sources of food, building materials, and toddy. They were valuable export commodities that could be converted into European goods, firearms, and status symbols. This shift from subsistence to commercial agriculture disrupted traditional land use patterns and social relationships in ways that would reverberate for generations. Perhaps more troubling was the emergence of what euphemistic historians called labour recruiting, but what modern observers would recognise as something considerably closer to human trafficking. Ships arrived promising employment opportunities in Queensland, Fiji, Hawaii, and Australia, but the reality often resembled involuntary servitude under conditions that would challenge the survival instincts of experienced pearl divers. Between 1845 and 1895, more than 9,000 Kiribati were taken abroad as labourers, with most never returning to their home islands. This blackbirding trade, named after the practice of capturing Pacific Islanders like exotic birds, devastated Kiribati communities by removing primarily young men during their most productive years. Families lost sons, brothers and fathers to ships that promised wages and adventure, but often delivered years of plantation labour under conditions that made traditional atoll fishing look like comfortable retirement. The demographic impact lasted decades, as communities struggled to maintain traditional activities with severely reduced populations. Into this increasingly complex colonial environment came Christian missionaries, beginning in the 1850s with representatives from the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. Dr. Hiram Bingham II, son of the famous Hawaiian missionary, arrived at Abayang in 1857 with several Hawaiian pastors bringing Protestant Christianity to the northern Gilbert Islands. His approach differed significantly from the purely extractive relationship that characterized most European contact. Missionaries actually intended to stay, learn local languages, and establish permanent institutions. Bingham's mission faced challenges that would have tested the patience of Job and the linguistic abilities of the entire United Nations Translation Department. Converting Kiribati to Christianity required not just learning their language, but translating complex theological concepts into cultural contexts that had no equivalent vocabulary for concepts like sin, salvation, and eternal damnation. When the Bible mentions mountains, for example, Bingham had to substitute hilly because Kiribati had never seen anything higher than their 13-foot coconut trees. The missionary effort gained momentum in 1870 when representatives from the London Missionary Society arrived in the southern Gilbert Islands, accompanied by Samoan pastors who could communicate more easily with Kiribati communities due to shared Polynesian cultural elements. This north-south division of missionary territories created an inadvertent denomination split that persists today, with Northern Islands predominantly influenced by American Protestant traditions, and Southern Islands showing stronger connections to Pacific Islander Christianity. Catholic missionaries arrived in 1888 under the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart, landing on Non-Uti and establishing permanent missions that competed directly with Protestant efforts. This created the kind of theological rivalry that medieval European towns would have found familiar, except conducted in tropical settings, with more coconuts and considerably more humidity than your average European religious dispute. The translation of the Bible into Gilbertese, completed in 1893, represented one of the most significant cultural achievements of the missionary period. Creating written versions of oral languages requires linguistic skills that would impress modern computational linguists, involving not just vocabulary translation but decisions about grammar, syntax, and cultural concepts that had never previously required standardized written forms. The process created the foundation for Kiribati literacy and provided a common written language that connected islands previously linked mainly by oral traditions. Educational systems introduced by missionaries transformed Kiribati society in ways that extended far beyond religious instruction. Mission schools taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and European languages alongside Christian doctrine, creating the first generation of Kiribati who could communicate directly with European traders and administrators without relying on interpreters whose reliability was often questionable and whose interests weren't necessarily aligned with Kiribati communities. The gradual establishment of European trading stations, missionary compounds, and temporary settlements created new social dynamics that challenged traditional Kiribati authority structures. European residents, including beachcombers, castaways, traders, and missionaries, brought different concepts of law, property rights, and social organization that often conflicted with established maneaba governance systems. Some adapted to Kiribati customs, others attempted to impose European social models, most muddled through with varying degrees of cultural sensitivity and practical success. Traditional Kiribati leaders faced unprecedented challenges in managing relationships with European residents who possessed powerful technologies, desirable trade goods, and connections to the wider world, but who often showed little understanding of or respect for established social protocols. Some chiefs learned to negotiate effectively with Europeans, using traditional diplomatic skills to manage new relationships. Others found their authority challenged by European residents who either ignored traditional hierarchies or actively worked to undermine them. The introduction of firearms significantly altered inter-island warfare and internal conflicts that had previously operated according to established protocols and limitations. Traditional weapons, shark-tooth swords, coral clubs, and woven armour could inflict serious damage, but required close combat that limited casualty rates and provided opportunities for negotiation and ritual resolution. European firearms made conflicts more deadly, while reducing opportunities for the kind of face-to-face negotiation that had traditionally prevented total warfare. Economic relationships between Kiribati communities and European traders created new forms of dependency that gradually undermined traditional self-sufficiency. Islands that had previously supplied all their own needs through fishing, agriculture, and inter-island trade began relying on imported goods, tools, clothing, preserved foods, and household items that required cash payments or commodity exports to obtain. This shift from subsistence to market economy brought conveniences and opportunities, but also vulnerabilities to global economic fluctuations that Kiribati communities couldn't control or predict. The period from 1860 to 1890 represented the height of unofficial European influence in Kiribati society. Islands were nominally independent, with traditional governance structures still functioning, but European residents held increasing economic and social power through their control of trade relationships, technological resources, and connections to external markets. This created a complex colonial situation where formal political control remained with Kiribati leaders, while practical power increasingly rested with European merchants and missionaries. One of the most colourful figures of this period was Tembinok, the last tyrant of Abemama, who successfully managed European contact while maintaining traditional authority through a combination of diplomatic skill, strategic ruthlessness, and what modern business schools would probably recognise as excellent brand management. Robert Louis Stevenson, who visited Abemama in 1889, described Tembinok as simultaneously charming and terrifying, a ruler who could quote Shakespeare and order executions with equal facility. Tembinok demonstrated how traditional Kiribati leaders could adapt to colonial pressures while preserving essential aspects of local authority. He controlled European access to his islands, negotiated favourable trade relationships, and maintained traditional governance systems while selectively adopting European technologies and ideas. His success showed that European colonial dominance wasn't inevitable. Skilled traditional leaders could navigate colonial relationships while preserving significant autonomy. As the 19th century progressed, it became increasingly clear that the informal colonial system couldn't persist indefinitely. Competing European interests, growing economic complexity, and the need for consistent legal frameworks pushed both Kiribati leaders and European residents toward more formal administrative arrangements. The stage was set for the establishment of direct British colonial control, though few participants probably anticipated how thoroughly this would transform Kiribati society. The era of first contact and informal colonialism had established patterns that would influence Kiribati development for generations. Traditional governance systems had proven remarkably adaptable to European contact, but they faced increasing pressure from economic, technological, and demographic changes that challenged their fundamental assumptions. Christianity had gained substantial influence while blending with traditional beliefs in ways that created uniquely Kiribati religious traditions. Most importantly, Kiribati communities had demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of overwhelming external pressures. They had survived disease epidemics, population loss, economic disruption, and cultural challenges that had devastated many other Pacific Island societies. Their success in maintaining essential aspects of traditional culture while adapting to colonial realities would prove crucial in navigating the more systematic colonial control that was about to begin. As we prepare to explore the next chapter in this remarkable story of survival and adaptation, remember that the encounters we've discussed tonight represented meetings between societies with completely different assumptions about everything from property rights to proper behavior at dinner parties. That any productive relationships emerged from such cultural collisions testifies to the wisdom, flexibility, and diplomatic skills of Kiribati leaders who somehow managed to navigate the transition from traditional independence to colonial integration while preserving the essential elements that made their society worth preserving. Chapter 4: World War II and Strategic Importance. The morning of December 8, 1941, began like any other peaceful day in the Gilbert Islands, with Kiribati communities going about their traditional activities, fishing, tending coconut groves, and maintaining the rhythms of life that had sustained them for centuries. Then, 6 hours after Pearl Harbor changed the world, a Japanese flying boat dropped 6 bombs on the government headquarters at Ocean Island, and suddenly the most remote nation on Earth found itself at the center of a global war that would reshape the Pacific forever. The strategic importance of these tiny coral atolls became immediately apparent to military planners who understood what 19th century whalers had learned the hard way. Controlling scattered islands across the Pacific wasn't just about territory. It was about controlling the vast ocean spaces between them. In an era when aircraft couldn't cross the entire Pacific without refueling stops, these specks of land became absolutely crucial stepping stones for any force attempting to project power across the world's largest ocean. The Japanese occupation began with the kind of methodical efficiency that characterized their early Pacific conquests. On December 9th and 10th, 1941, just 2 days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces landed on Butaritari and Tarawa, rounded up the European residents, and informed them they could not leave without permission from the naval commander. It was the beginning of an occupation that would transform these peaceful atolls into fortified bases bristling with coastal guns, underground bunkers, and defensive positions that would make them virtually impregnable to conventional assault. For the approximately 400 Kiribati living on Betio, the largest islet of Tarawa Atoll, the Japanese arrival marked the beginning of a nightmare that would challenge every aspect of their traditional way of life. The occupying forces destroyed all sailing and fishing canoes to prevent escape, cut down precious coconut trees and buried crops like babai taro, and demolished local houses to clear space for military fortifications. Imagine watching centuries of careful cultivation and construction disappear in weeks to make room for concrete bunkers and artillery positions. The Japanese transformation of Betio into a fortress represented military engineering on a scale that would have impressed medieval castle builders. Under the direction of experienced engineers, construction workers, including forced labourers from Korea and Okinawa, built over 100 concrete pillboxes, extensive trench systems, coastal gun emplacements, and defensive positions that covered virtually every approach to the island. They installed artillery pieces originally used in the Russian-Japanese War of 1905, proving that in warfare, recycling isn't just environmentally responsible, it's strategically sensible. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, the Japanese commander who took charge of Tarawa's defences in July 1943, was confident enough in his preparations to boast that it would take 1 million men 100 years to conquer Tarawa. This wasn't mere bravado. By November 1943, Betio had become one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Pacific, a tiny island that bristled with enough firepower to sink a fleet and enough defensive positions to house a small army. The Kiribati population endured occupation conditions that would test the survival skills of communities that had already mastered living on coral atolls in the middle of nowhere. Japanese authorities, assisted by a resident trader named Chosito Kanzaki, who had married into the local community and served as interpreter, mobilized Gilbertese men as forced laborers while maintaining strict regulations to minimize contact between Japanese soldiers and Kiribati women. This created a complex social dynamic where traditional community structures had to adapt to military occupation while trying to preserve essential cultural practices. The Banabans on Ocean Island faced even harsher treatment during the occupation. Most were deported to other islands, Nauru, Tarawa, Kozre, or Truk, leaving only about 150 of the youngest and strongest workers to supply fish for Japanese forces. Those who remained endured systematic abuse, malnutrition, and violence that culminated in a massacre on August 20th, 1945, 5 days after Japan's surrender, when Japanese troops killed all but one of the remaining Banabans in a final, senseless act of violence. Meanwhile, Allied forces were developing plans for what would become one of the most challenging amphibious operations of the Pacific War. The Americans recognized that Tarawa's strategic position made it essential to their island-hopping strategy. The systematic capture of Japanese-held islands to establish airfields and naval bases for further advances toward Japan. Tarawa's capture was necessary before they could proceed to the Marshall Islands, which were necessary before they could attack the Marianas, which were necessary for launching bombing campaigns against Japan itself. The planning for Operation Galvanic, the code name for the Gilbert Islands invasion, revealed the immense complexity of conducting amphibious warfare across distances that challenge modern logistics. The operation required coordination between naval forces, marine assault troops, army units, air support, and supply systems operating across thousands of miles of ocean with no room for error or second chances. Getting it wrong meant watching landing craft full of Marines disappear beneath Pacific swells while enemy artillery turned beaches into killing fields. On November 20th, 1943, approximately 18,000 US Marines of the 2nd Marine Division approached Betio aboard landing craft that represented the latest advances in amphibious warfare technology. Unfortunately, the latest advances still couldn't solve the basic problem of coral reefs, shallow water, and tidal calculations that proved devastatingly inaccurate. When landing craft grounded on reefs hundreds of yards from shore, Marines had to abandon their vehicles and wade through chest-deep water under intense enemy fire, a situation that made military textbooks suddenly seem rather theoretical. The Battle of Tarawa lasted 76 hours of combat so intense that military historians still struggle to convey its brutality to audiences comfortable with air-conditioned classrooms and peaceful coffee shops. Over 4,500 Japanese defenders, supplemented by Korean forced labourers, fought with the kind of desperate determination that comes from knowing retreat is impossible and surrender means dishonour. They had prepared defensive positions that maximised their firepower while minimising American advantages in numbers and equipment. American forces discovered that preliminary naval bombardments, while impressive enough to wake sea turtles on distant islands, had done remarkably little damage to concrete pillboxes built to withstand direct hits from heavy artillery. Japanese defenders emerged from underground shelters as soon as the bombardment lifted, manned their weapons, and proceeded to demonstrate why military planners should never underestimate the effectiveness of well-prepared defensive positions occupied by troops with nothing left to lose. The fighting on Betio required American forces to capture defensive positions one by one through close combat that would have challenged medieval siege specialists. Marines used flamethrowers, explosives and hand grenades to clear bunkers, while Japanese defenders responded with suicide attacks that turned individual pillboxes into scenes from the most violent war movies ever imagined. Tanks, artillery, aircraft, and even bulldozers were pressed into service for what amounted to the most expensive real estate development project in Pacific history. By November 23rd, American forces had secured Betio at a cost that shocked the American public and changed military thinking about Pacific warfare. Over 1,000 Americans died in 76 hours, casualties approaching those suffered during 6 months of fighting on Guadalcanal. Japanese losses were even more devastating. Of the 4,500 defenders, only 17 survived as prisoners, along with 147 Korean labourers. The remainder died fighting defensive positions they had built with their own hands. The Battle of Tarawa taught American military leaders crucial lessons about amphibious warfare that would save countless lives in subsequent operations. Better reconnaissance, more precise pre-landing bombardment, improved amphibious landing vehicles, waterproof radios, and enhanced coordination between naval, air, and ground forces all emerged from analysing what went wrong and what worked during the 76 hours of chaos on Betio's beaches. For Kiribati communities, liberation brought different challenges. American forces were generally respectful occupiers who provided medical care, employment opportunities, and protection from further Japanese attacks. But they also transformed the islands into major military bases with runways, supply depots, and facilities that employed thousands of personnel. Traditional life had to adapt once again to military occupation, though this time by allies who saw Kiribati as partners rather than subjects. The American presence introduced Kiribati to industrial-scale logistics, modern medical practices, advanced communications technology, and economic opportunities that extended far beyond traditional subsistence activities. Many Kiribati learned English, developed technical skills, and gained exposure to global economic systems that would influence post-war development. However, they also witnessed environmental damage from military construction that would take decades to heal. The simultaneous Battle of Makin on Butaritari Atoll demonstrated how different tactical approaches could achieve similar objectives with dramatically different costs. American forces faced lighter Japanese resistance at Makin and secured the atoll by November 23rd with far fewer casualties than those suffered at Tarawa. The contrast highlighted the importance of intelligence, preparation, and understanding enemy capabilities, lessons that would prove invaluable in subsequent Pacific campaigns. The broader strategic impact of Operation Galvanic extended far beyond the Gilbert Islands. Success at Tarawa and Macon provided Allied forces with air bases capable of supporting operations across the Central Pacific, established logistics networks for further advances, and demonstrated Japanese vulnerability to coordinated amphibious assaults. The psychological impact was equally important. Japanese forces realized they could no longer defend isolated positions against determined American attacks backed by overwhelming material superiority. For Kiribati communities, World War II represented a traumatic interruption of traditional life that also accelerated their integration into the modern world. The war brought death, destruction, and displacement, but it also brought exposure to new technologies, ideas, and opportunities that would influence post-war development. Traditional leaders who had navigated colonial pressures now faced the challenge of managing relationships with liberation forces while preserving essential cultural practices. The environmental impact of military operations left lasting changes to atoll ecosystems that had evolved over millennia. Airfield construction, defensive position excavation, and military supply operations altered drainage patterns, damaged coral reefs, and introduced non-native species that continue affecting island environments today. Some areas of Betio still contain unexploded ordnance that makes development projects challenging and occasionally dangerous. Post-war recovery required rebuilding not just physical infrastructure but social systems disrupted by 3 years of military occupation. Traditional governance structures had to reassert authority while adapting to changed circumstances. Families had to reunite after forced separations, and communities had to restore agricultural systems damaged by military construction. The resilience Kiribati had developed over centuries of surviving in challenging environments proved crucial for surviving the aftermath of global warfare. The establishment of war memorials and cemeteries on Betio created permanent reminders of the battle's human cost while honoring sacrifice on both sides. American and Japanese memorials stand within sight of each other, acknowledging courage and loss that transcends national boundaries. These monuments serve not just as historical markers but as reminders that the price of strategic objectives is always paid in human lives. Archaeological efforts continue recovering remains of service members killed during the battle, with organizations like History Flight and the Defense POW, MIA Accounting Agency working to identify individuals whose sacrifice deserves recognition. These ongoing excavations reveal not just the battle's intensity but the importance of remembering individual stories within larger historical narratives that can otherwise reduce human experience to strategic abstractions. The wartime experience fundamentally altered Kiribati's relationships with the outside world, while reinforcing the importance of community cooperation for survival under extreme circumstances. Communities that had endured Japanese occupation and American liberation had demonstrated remarkable adaptability while preserving essential cultural values. These experiences would prove invaluable as they approached the challenges of decolonization and independence in the post-war period. The strategic importance that made Kiribati crucial during World War II, its central Pacific location and vast ocean territories, continues influencing its role in contemporary geopolitics. Though fortunately without the immediate threat of amphibious invasion by heavily armed forces seeking strategic advantage in global conflicts. Chapter 5: Independence and Modern Challenges. The journey from wartime devastation to national independence began in the rubble of post-war reconstruction, when Kiribati communities faced the challenge of rebuilding not just their physical infrastructure, but their relationship with the modern world. The war had brought them into direct contact with industrial-scale logistics, advanced communications, and global economic systems, while simultaneously demonstrating that their strategic location made them subjects rather than partners in decisions about their own future. The 1950s and 60s saw the emergence of an independence movement that would transform these scattered atolls into a sovereign nation, though the path proved considerably more complicated than anyone initially anticipated. The process began with the kind of ethnic tensions that make modern multiculturalism advocates appreciate the complexity of managing diverse populations within artificial colonial boundaries created by administrators who apparently used rulers and limited geographical knowledge to draw lines on maps. The Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony, created by British administrative convenience rather than cultural logic, contained two distinct populations with different languages, traditions, and perspectives on their collective future. The Ellice Islanders, who were predominantly Polynesian, found themselves increasingly uncomfortable as a minority within a colony dominated by the Micronesian Gilbert Islanders. It was like being the only vegetarian family at a neighbourhood barbecue convention, technically part of the community, but with fundamentally different ideas about what constitutes appropriate dinner conversation. By the 1960s, local political movements had begun organising to address these tensions and push for greater self-determination. The Gilbertese National Party, formed in 1965, became the colony's first formal political party, led by Ruben Uatioa, who argued that the Gilbertese majority deserved greater representation in colonial administration. The party's platform focused on promoting Gilbertese culture and interests while expressing frustration with British administrators who seemed to prefer Ellisian civil servants for important positions. The political dynamics were further complicated by the continuing Banaban legal battle over phosphate mining royalties and environmental compensation. The Banabans, living in exile on Rabi Island in Fiji since the 1940s, sued the British government for a greater share of phosphate revenues and compensation for the environmental devastation of their homeland. Their case highlighted the uncomfortable reality that colonial prosperity often came at the expense of indigenous peoples who had little say in how their resources were exploited. The United Nations Special Committee on Decolonization, established after World War II, began pressuring Britain to accelerate the independence process for its Pacific territories. The committee sent visiting missions to assess local conditions and attitudes, finding that while most Kiribati supported eventual independence, they had serious concerns about economic viability and the challenge of governing scattered islands with limited resources and infrastructure. In 1974, mounting ethnic tensions led to a referendum in the Ellice Islands that would fundamentally reshape the region's political geography. Despite warnings that separation would mean losing access to phosphate royalties and colonial assets, 92% of Tuvaluans voted to secede from the colony. The overwhelming vote demonstrated that sometimes cultural autonomy matters more than economic security, a lesson that would resonate with independence movements worldwide. The separation process proved remarkably civilized compared to many colonial partitions. On October 1st, 1975, the Ellice Islands became the separate British colony of Tuvalu, with full administrative separation occurring on January 1st, 1976. Tuvalu achieved independence in 1978, leaving the Gilbert Islands to continue their own path towards self-governance with a much more culturally homogeneous population. The Gilbert Islands obtained internal self-government in 1977, establishing the framework for democratic governance while maintaining British oversight of foreign affairs and defence. The February 1978 elections saw the emergence of Ieremia Tabai, a 27-year-old accountant educated in New Zealand, as Chief Minister. His victory represented a generational shift toward leaders who combined traditional Kiribati cultural knowledge with modern administrative skills acquired through overseas education. Tabai's background perfectly embodied the challenges facing the emerging nation. Born on Nonuti in 1949, he had attended King George V High School in Tarawa before receiving a New Zealand government scholarship for further education. He studied at St Andrews College in Christchurch and Victoria University in Wellington, earning a commerce degree before returning to work as an accountant in the colonial administration. His experience bridging traditional Kiribati society and modern bureaucratic systems would prove crucial for managing independence. The independence negotiations required careful balancing of multiple competing interests and practical concerns that would have challenged experienced diplomats. Tabai led delegations to London and Washington, D.C., negotiating financial support from Britain as phosphate resources became depleted, discussing access to colonial reserve funds, addressing the legal status of maneaba, and resolving American territorial claims in the region. The complexity of these discussions reflected the reality that independence meant assuming responsibility for problems created during decades of colonial administration. The Banaban issue proved particularly intractable, with the community demanding either independence or incorporation into Fiji rather than inclusion in the new Kiribati state. Their position was understandable. They had never been governed by the Gilbert Islanders. Their island had been devastated by phosphate mining, and their people lived in exile with full Fijian citizenship. However, Britain rejected Banaban independence proposals, insisting that Banaba remain part of Kiribati despite the obvious problems this would create. On July 12, 1979, the Republic of Kiribati achieved independence within the Commonwealth of Nations, with Iremia Tabai becoming the world's youngest head of state at age 29. The independence celebration required managing visits from numerous international dignitaries, while demonstrating that the new nation could handle complex diplomatic protocols despite its limited resources and infrastructure. The event served as Tabai's first major test as president, establishing precedents for how Kiribati would engage with the international community. The choice of the name Kiribati, the local pronunciation of Gilberts, reflected careful consideration of the new nation's identity and scope. While the indigenous name for the Gilbert Islands was Tungaroo, the leadership chose Kiribati because it acknowledged the inclusion of the Phoenix and Line Islands, which had never been considered part of the traditional Tungaroo chain. The decision demonstrated the pragmatic approach to nation-building that would characterize Tabai's administration. The United States relinquished claims to 14 islands in the Phoenix and Line chains through the 1979 Treaty of Tarawa, finally resolving territorial disputes that dated back to 19th century guano mining claims. This treaty significantly expanded Kiribati's territory and maritime jurisdiction, creating one of the world's largest exclusive economic zones, despite having minimal land area. The agreement showed how independence could actually increase a nation's territorial control when handled through skilled diplomacy. President Tabai faced the enormous challenge of creating functional democratic institutions while managing an economy entirely dependent on depleted phosphate resources and foreign aid. His administration established the principle that Kiribati should be better poor but free, emphasizing self-reliance over dependency on external assistance. This philosophy guided policies aimed at developing sustainable revenue sources, particularly fisheries management and copra production, while building the institutional capacity needed for effective governance. The Revenue Equalization Reserve Fund, established using phosphate revenues, became crucial for maintaining government operations as mining declined. Tabai's government invested these funds conservatively, using interest earnings to support development projects while preserving capital for future needs. This approach demonstrated remarkable fiscal responsibility for a new nation facing immediate economic pressures and long-term sustainability challenges. Tabai's administration also negotiated innovative fishing agreements that balanced economic needs with environmental protection. A controversial deal with Soviet fishing authorities provided significant revenue, but required careful management to prevent overfishing in Kiribati's exclusive economic zone. When the Soviets declined to renew their agreement, citing insufficient catches relative to licensing fees, it demonstrated both the challenges and opportunities of managing marine resources as a primary economic asset. The new nation's democratic institutions proved remarkably stable, despite the challenges of governing 33 islands scattered across millions of square miles of ocean. The constitution established a presidential system with a unicameral parliament, incorporating traditional maneaba decision-making processes into modern democratic structures. Representatives from outer islands could participate in national governance while maintaining connections to their local communities and traditional authorities. Tabai served the maximum 3 terms allowed by the Constitution, stepping down in 1991 after 12 years as president. His tenure established important precedents for peaceful transitions of power and constitutional governance that would influence Kiribati's political culture for decades. The constitutional term limits, unusual for developing nations, reflected the traditional Kiribati value of collective leadership over individual authority. Economic development remained the persistent challenge for post-independence Kiribati. The exhaustion of phosphate resources left the nation dependent on fishing licenses, copra exports, and remittances from Kiribati working abroad, particularly as seafarers on international vessels. Tourism existed but operated on a scale that made boutique hotels look like massive resort complexes. Remote Pacific atolls with limited infrastructure weren't exactly competing with Caribbean destinations for package tour operators. The geographical challenges of governing scattered islands continued affecting every aspect of national development. Transportation between islands remained irregular and weather-dependent. Communications infrastructure operated at speeds that would make dial-up internet users nostalgic, and providing basic services like healthcare and education to outer islands required creativity and determination that would impress humanitarian aid organizations. Contemporary Kiribati faces challenges that make traditional development models seem quaint and inadequate. Climate change threatens the very existence of low-lying atolls through sea level rise, increased storm intensity, and saltwater intrusion into freshwater supplies. Some outer islands have already lost significant land area, while others face the prospect of becoming uninhabitable within decades rather than centuries. The current administration under President Taneti Maamau, elected in 2016, has taken different approaches to these challenges than previous governments. Maamau dismissed his predecessor's migration with dignity policy, arguing that divine will alone could destroy Kiribati, and focusing instead on adaptation strategies, including land reclamation and infrastructure development. His Kiribati vision for 20 years KV20 emphasizes tourism development and foreign investment while seeking international support for raising land levels in vulnerable areas. Maamau's decision to switch diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China in 2019 created significant domestic political controversy and international concern. The decision split his own party, with 13 members of parliament forming the opposition Kiribati First Party in protest. Critics argued that the switch occurred without adequate consultation and potentially compromised Kiribati's relationships with traditional partners like Australia and New Zealand. The modern challenges facing Kiribati extend beyond climate change and diplomatic realignments to include population pressures, economic diversification, and maintaining cultural identity in an increasingly connected world. South Tarawa's population density rivals Hong Kong's, creating urban problems on a coral atoll that was never designed to support concentrated populations. Migration from outer islands to the capital creates both opportunities and challenges for families seeking better education and employment prospects. The fishing industry provides crucial revenue through licensing agreements with foreign fleets, but managing these relationships requires balancing economic needs with environmental protection and ensuring that Kiribati receives fair compensation for access to its marine resources. Traditional fishing practices must coexist with industrial-scale operations that could easily overwhelm local ecosystems if poorly managed. Education and healthcare systems continue operating under constraints that would challenge the most resourceful administrators. Outer island schools might have one teacher managing multiple grades, while medical emergencies often require transportation to Tarawa for treatment. The dedication of teachers and healthcare workers serving remote communities deserves recognition, alongside any discussion of infrastructure limitations. Despite these challenges, Kiribati has maintained political stability and cultural continuity that many larger nations might envy. Democratic institutions function effectively, peaceful transitions of power occur regularly, and traditional governance structures complement rather than conflict with modern democratic processes. The maneaba system continues, providing community-level decision-making that incorporates everyone's voice while maintaining cultural practices that define Kiribati identity. The nation's response to global challenges reflects both the vulnerability and resilience that have characterized Kiribati society throughout its history. Communities that survived centuries of isolation, colonial occupation, and wartime devastation have developed adaptive strategies that serve them well in addressing contemporary threats. Traditional knowledge about sustainable resource management, community cooperation, and long-term thinking proves remarkably relevant for confronting modern challenges. International recognition of Kiribati's unique situation has led to various support programs and partnerships aimed at addressing climate change impacts, economic development needs, and governance challenges. However, external assistance must balance respect for Kiribati autonomy with practical support for adaptation and development initiatives. The experiences of colonial administration and post-war reconstruction have taught Kiribati leaders to approach international partnerships with both appreciation and caution. Looking toward the future, Kiribati faces decisions that will determine whether these 33 atolls continue supporting vibrant Kiribati communities or become footnotes in discussions about climate change and small island developing states. The choices involve not just technical solutions to rising seas and economic challenges, but fundamental questions about how much change traditional societies can absorb while maintaining the cultural values that make survival worthwhile in the first place. Chapter 6: Climate Crisis and Future. The story of Kiribati concludes not with an ending, but with the most consequential chapter in human history. A chapter being written in real time across 33 coral atolls that serve as humanity's early warning system for the age of climate change. What happens here in the coming decades will determine whether small island nations represent footnotes in discussions about rising seas or pioneers in humanity's greatest adaptation challenge since the last ice age. The numbers tell a story that would make statisticians weep and poets reach for metaphors about inevitability. Sea levels around Kiribati rise at 4.5 millimeters per year, nearly double the global average due to Pacific Ocean circulation patterns that concentrate thermal expansion in this particular corner of the world. For islands where the highest elevation measures 13 feet above sea level, these millimeters accumulate with the inexorable persistence of compound interest working against human prosperity. Scientists project that by 2050, sea levels could rise between 24 and 32 centimeters, numbers that sound modest until you consider that they represent the difference between dry land and permanent inundation for communities that have called. These atolls home for thousands of years. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change suggests that Kiribati could disappear entirely by the middle of this century. The visible impacts already transform daily life in ways that make climate change discussions feel less abstract and more like neighbourhood planning meetings, where the neighbourhood happens to be dissolving. High tides increasingly flood homes, schools and hospitals on South Tarawa, forcing families to time their daily activities around tide charts with the precision that suburban commuters once reserved for rush hour traffic schedules. Saltwater intrusion threatens the freshwater lens, that miraculous bubble of rainwater that sits beneath the soil, providing the only source of potable water for most communities. When storm surges push saltwater into the ground, contamination can persist for months, forcing families to rely entirely on rainwater collection or expensive imported water. Traditional agriculture becomes impossible when soil salinity reaches levels that would make oceanographers consider the ground suitable for marine biology experiments rather than farming. The human dimension of these changes reveals itself in decisions that previous generations never imagined confronting. Families debate whether children should learn traditional fishing techniques or focus on skills that might prove useful in Australia or New Zealand. Communities decide which infrastructure investments make sense when the infrastructure might be underwater within decades. Former President Anote Tong emerged as the international face of climate vulnerability during his tenure from 2003 to 2016, transforming Kiribati from an obscure Pacific Island nation into a symbol of climate injustice that resonated with audiences from United Nations assemblies to documentary film festivals. Tong's Migration with Dignity policy represented the first systematic attempt by any nation to prepare for climate-induced relocation while preserving cultural identity and community cohesion. Vocational training programs prepared young people for industries in Australia and New Zealand, while diplomatic negotiations sought to establish pathways for permanent resettlement that would maintain family connections. The most dramatic symbol of this approach was Tong's 2014 purchase of 20 square kilometres of land on Vanuatu in Fiji, the first international land purchase explicitly intended for climate relocation. The decision cost $7 million, representing over 4% of Kiribati's annual budget, establishing a precedent that other threatened island nations watched carefully. However, Tong's climate policies faced significant domestic opposition from communities that viewed migration planning as premature surrender to forces that divine intervention might yet overcome. Traditional Kiribati beliefs hold that only God can create or destroy islands, making discussions about relocation feel like admissions of insufficient faith rather than prudent planning. The 2016 election of President Taneti Maamau marked a dramatic shift in Kiribati's climate strategy, replacing migration planning with adaptation measures that emphasize economic development and infrastructure projects designed to make the islands more resilient rather than preparing for their abandonment. Maamau's philosophy rejects what he calls misleading and pessimistic scenarios of a sinking nation, arguing instead that proper development can enable Kiribati to thrive despite climate challenges while maintaining the cultural and spiritual connections that make survival meaningful. The Kiribati Vision for 20 Years, KV20, announced in 2017, represents the most ambitious adaptation strategy attempted by any small island developing state. The plan calls for raising key areas of South Tarawa and Christmas Island by 1 to 2 meters through dredging operations that would extract sand and gravel from deep lagoons for land reclamation projects. The engineering challenges alone would make civil engineers question whether they inadvertently enrolled in marine biology programs, but international experts suggest the approach is technically feasible with sufficient funding and political commitment. Dr. Paul Kench from Simon Fraser University, who advises the Kiribati government on island raising projects, explains that the process involves dredging aggregate materials from lagoons where natural sedimentation has accumulated over centuries. These materials can be deposited on existing islands to raise elevation and create additional land area, though the projects require staged relocation of existing infrastructure and communities during construction. The approach essentially accelerates natural atoll building processes that normally occur over geological timescales, compressing centuries of coral growth and sedimentation into decades of human engineering. The costs of such adaptation measures reflect the harsh mathematics of climate change for small island states. European aid agencies estimate that comprehensive mitigation and adaptation programs could consume 35% of Kiribati's gross domestic product, a proportion that would make developed nations reconsider their commitment to maintaining coastal cities, much less raising entire island chains. President Ma Mao seeks international support, particularly from China through Belt and Road Initiative partnerships, while insisting that Kiribati will maintain independence and avoid unsustainable debt burdens that could compromise sovereignty. China's involvement in Kiribati's adaptation projects raises geopolitical implications that extend far beyond engineering considerations. Christmas Island sits 2,000 kilometers south of Hawaii, placing any Chinese-supported infrastructure projects within the strategic sphere of United States Pacific Fleet operations. The 1979 Treaty of Tarawa allows the United States to maintain military bases in Kiribati and requires consultation before other nations build military facilities, but dual-use infrastructure creates ambiguities that make regional security analysts nervous about precedents being set for Chinese involvement in Pacific Island adaptation projects. Ma Mao's 2019 decision to switch diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China created domestic political controversy that split his own party and generated international concern about Beijing's influence in Pacific Island climate policies. 13 members of parliament formed the opposition Kiribati First Party in protest, arguing that the decision occurred without adequate consultation and potentially compromised relationships with traditional partners like Australia and New Zealand. The KV20 development plan extends beyond land reclamation to encompass economic diversification strategies that could reduce Kiribati's vulnerability to climate impacts, while improving living standards for communities that currently face limited employment opportunities. Tourism development features prominently in these plans, with proposals for resort construction and ecotourism programs that could generate revenue for adaptation projects while showcasing successful climate resilience strategies to international audiences. However, tourism development faces obvious challenges when the primary attraction, pristine coral atolls, remains threatened by the same climate changes that create the need for tourism revenue. Fisheries management represents another cornerstone of Kiribati's economic strategy, building on the nation's enormous exclusive economic zone and strategic location in prime tuna fishing grounds. The challenge involves balancing immediate revenue needs against long-term sustainability considerations that become more complex as climate change affects marine ecosystems and fish migration patterns. Current fishing license agreements generate crucial government revenue, but negotiations with international fishing fleets require constant vigilance to prevent overfishing that could compromise future income streams. Population distribution within Kiribati creates additional complexity for adaptation planning, as migration from outer islands to South Tarawa concentrates more than half the national population on a narrow atoll where population density rivals Hong Kong, despite lacking the infrastructure, employment opportunities, or urban planning that make high-density living functional. South Tarawa faces sanitation challenges, unemployment, and escalating living costs that make climate adaptation more difficult when basic infrastructure already struggles to meet current needs. International support for Kiribati's climate adaptation efforts reflects both genuine concern for climate justice and the recognition that small island states serve as testing grounds for adaptation strategies that larger nations may need to employ as climate impacts intensify globally. Successful adaptation in Kiribati could provide models for coastal communities worldwide, while failure would demonstrate the limitations of current approaches to managing climate displacement and community resilience. The legal dimensions of climate-induced migration continue evolving through test cases that could establish precedents for how international law addresses displacement caused by environmental changes rather than political persecution. The Taitiota case, where an Kiribati man argued that deportation from New Zealand would violate his right to life due to climate risks in Kiribati, failed on factual grounds but established that future claims might succeed as climate impacts worsen. These legal developments could eventually create pathways for climate migration that preserve dignity and community connections. Cultural preservation emerges as perhaps the most crucial aspect of any adaptation strategy, as physical survival means little if it requires abandoning the values, practices, and relationships that define Kiribati identity. Traditional knowledge about marine environments, sustainable resource management, and community decision-making through maneaba processes provides foundations for adaptation strategies that remain grounded in Kiribati values, rather than simply adopting external solutions that may work technically but fail culturally. The question of intergenerational responsibility permeates every discussion about Kiribati's future, as current decisions will determine what kind of world Kiribati children inherit and whether they will inherit it as Kiribati at all. Parents face choices about education investments, language preservation, and cultural transmission that previous generations could assume would continue naturally within stable geographical and social contexts. Young Kiribati grow up knowing that their futures may unfold in Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, or other countries rather than the islands where their families have lived for millennia. This knowledge shapes educational choices, career planning, and personal relationships in ways that make traditional coming-of-age processes more complex when home might not exist in the same form throughout their lifetimes. International climate negotiations treat Kiribati as a symbol of climate injustice, a nation that's contributed virtually nothing to global greenhouse gas emissions yet faces the most severe consequences of climate change caused by industrial activities in wealthy countries. However, symbolic status can become a burden when international attention focuses on victimization rather than agency, portraying Kiribati as helpless recipients rather than people making difficult choices about their future with remarkable courage and creativity. Technology offers potential solutions ranging from practical engineering projects to floating islands and artificial reefs that demonstrate human creativity in addressing unprecedented challenges. More immediately, practical technologies focus on improving water security, renewable energy systems, and communications infrastructure that could make outer islands more viable places to live, even as climate impacts intensify. The timeline for climate impacts creates urgency that makes long-term planning feel simultaneously crucial and potentially futile. Adaptation projects that require decades to complete must begin immediately to have any chance of success. Yet the same urgency makes communities question whether such investments make sense when alternative approaches might prove more effective. The global significance of Kiribati's experience extends beyond the specific challenges facing these 33 atolls to fundamental questions about how human societies adapt to environmental changes that exceed historical precedents. Climate change will affect every nation on Earth, though few face such immediate and total challenges as small island states. The story of Kiribati ultimately reflects humanity's relationship with the natural environment and our capacity to adapt to changes that we have caused but struggle to control. These 33 atolls serve as a microcosm of global climate challenges, demonstrating both human vulnerability and human resilience in confronting environmental changes that reshape the fundamental conditions of life on Earth. Whether Kiribati's future involves successful adaptation, managed migration, or some combination of both approaches, the Kiribati experience of confronting climate change with dignity, creativity, and determination provides inspiration for communities worldwide facing similar challenges at different scales. The lessons learned here about community resilience, international cooperation, technological innovation, and cultural preservation under extreme pressure will prove valuable long after the immediate challenges facing these specific islands have been resolved. The Atlas of Human Geography continues expanding to include new territories of experience and new definitions of home, community, and belonging that transcend traditional boundaries between land and sea, past and future, local identity and global citizenship. Kiribati's contribution to that expanding atlas ensures that future generations will remember not just what was lost to rising seas, but what was preserved, created, and shared by people who refuse to let circumstances beyond their control define the limits of their hope, agency, and determination to create meaningful lives for their children and grandchildren across the vast Pacific that has always connected rather than separated the communities scattered across its waters.